was a normal night about a month ago. I'm 15, and like most nights, I was playing video games. Around 11 p.m., just as I was getting ready to crash, I heard the doorbell ring. At first, I didn't think much of it and started walking downstairs. But halfway down, I stopped in my tracks. Who rings the doorbell at 11 p.m.? The thought hit me suddenly, and I quietly made my way back upstairs, unsure of what to expect. Something felt wrong. I stood in the hallway, waiting. Exactly 1 minute later, the doorbell rang again. Twice this time. By then, my parents had woken up and come out of their room. They looked at me, confused. I shrugged, just as unsure as they were about what was happening. The air felt tense, like we were all waiting for something worse to happen. Then the banging started. It was loud, louder than I expected, and it sent a jolt through the house. My mom jumped at the sound, and even though my dad wasn't showing it, I could see the confusion in his face. He didn't seem scared, but something in his expression changed. Without a word, he headed downstairs to check it out, and I quietly followed, not sure what to expect. When he reached the front door, he hesitated for a moment before peering through the peephole. I couldn't see who was outside, but after a moment, my dad cracked the door open. I stood at the top of the stairs listening, and that's when I heard our neighbor shouting. He was yelling about how this house was his, how we had somehow stolen it from him. His words were filled with anger, and I could tell from the tone of his voice that he wasn't thinking straight. My dad's tension turned to frustration as the yelling continued. He didn't say much in return, just kept his voice steady, trying to stay calm. But it wasn't long before he decided there was no point in engaging. He quickly shut the door and started back upstairs, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. Before my dad even made it halfway up the stairs, the banging resumed, only this time it was more intense. I froze as I realized our neighbor wasn't just knocking. He was throwing his body against the door, trying to break it down. The sound of wood splintering echoed through the hallway, and I could see the alarm spreading across my dad's face. Everything kicked into motion after that. My dad rushed back to the door, using his body to brace it as the impact continued. My mom hurried to get my younger siblings, and I quickly grabbed my phone to call 911. My heart was racing as I explained the situation to the operator, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the door, afraid it might give way at any moment. For what felt like an eternity, the pounding continued, but after about 5 minutes, it suddenly stopped. My dad kept his weight against the door, but we all held our breath, unsure if it was really over. I stayed on the phone waiting for the police to arrive, but a sinking feeling in my stomach told me it wasn't done yet. I crept over to the front window and peeked outside. That's when I saw him. Our neighbor was sitting in his Jeep, parked in our driveway, just staring at the house. For a moment, I couldn't understand what he was doing, but then the engine roared to life. The tires squealed as he revved the engine, and it hit me. He was trying to intimidate us, to scare us into leaving the house. He didn't drive into the house, but the threat was clear. I backed away from the window, unsure of what he might do next. The operator reassured me that help was on the way, but the tension in the house was unbearable. My siblings were terrified, and I tried my best to keep them calm, cracking jokes even though my own hands were shaking. Finally, after what felt like forever, the flashing lights of police cars lit up the street. They arrived and quickly arrested our neighbor, dragging him away from the chaos he had caused. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. The next morning, I stepped outside to head to school, but the sight of tire marks leading up to our front door sent a chill down my spine. He had come so close to ramming his car into the house. It felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare, but it had all been real. Even though the immediate danger was over, I couldn't shake the fear that had settled deep in my chest. He lived right next door, and despite everything that had happened, he wasn't going anywhere. Every time I looked out the window or stepped outside, the thought lingered in the back of my mind. What if he did it again? "2 years ago, I moved to the UK for university. I had always wanted to go there, and I needed to get away from my parents. Home had become too toxic, and I couldn't take it anymore. In my first year at uni, I stayed in a student accommodation and met some great people. It was a good year. I hadn't met my boyfriend yet, but I was enjoying my time away from my family and experiencing what independence truly felt like. By the time second year rolled around, I decided to move into a house with some friends. It was still part of the student accommodation system, but at least we had more space. We weren't confined to small shared flats like before, and we didn't have to worry as much about noise or parties. My room was on the ground floor, and my window opened to a small backyard. I smoked, so I would go out there every day. There was an old, flimsy wooden door in the backyard that led to the street, the kind of door you would use to take out the bins. It could only be locked from the inside, and it was so old that we had to tie it shut with some string to keep it from swinging open. We had neighbors on both sides of the house. Families lived on one side, while the other side was rented to 5 men who were way too old to be students. They were strange, to say the least. I didn't think much of them until one day when the police were called. One of the men had attacked his flatmates with a kitchen knife and set part of the kitchen on fire. When I heard screaming, I went outside with my flatmates and saw one of the guys covered in blood. He had cuts all over his arms and a nasty wound on his head. We didn't know what to do, so we offered him some help. We gave him an old t-shirt to change into and some bandages to clean himself up. While we waited for the police to finish their work, I saw the guy responsible for the attack being escorted out of the house in handcuffs. I didn't ask for details and the police didn't share much, but what happened next made me wish I'd never helped. The man we bandaged up started acting strange. I'd see him in the street, and he'd give me these long, unsettling looks. He'd try to talk to me, but I always avoided him. I didn't trust him. One day while I was walking to the corner shop, he appeared out of nowhere and approached me. His manner was off and I immediately felt uncomfortable. I ignored him, hoping he'd take the hint, but instead he said he'd just wait for me in front of my house. I tried to brush it off as a joke, but when I came back from the shop and turned onto my street, there he was, sitting on my doorstep with one of his flatmates. My heart sank. I didn't want to confront him, so I walked back to the shop and called my only male flatmate. Unfortunately, he wasn't home, and neither was anyone else. I had no choice but to wait it out. After what felt like an eternity, they finally left. I sprinted home, locked the door, and tried to push the incident out of my mind. But the glass panel in the front door made me uneasy. It was frosted, but you could still make out shapes behind it. I started feeling like I was being watched, even when no one was there. Things took a darker turn a few weeks later. One evening, while smoking in the backyard, I noticed the wooden door was wide open. The string we used to keep it closed had been cut. For some reason, I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed one of my flatmates had taken the bins out and forgotten to tie it shut again. I closed it and put a new string on. That night, the usual yelling and fighting from the neighbor's house woke us up again. It had become so normal that we barely paid attention to it anymore. But this time was different. My boyfriend was staying over, and he never woke up for anything, yet something disturbed him that night. I was fast asleep when he gently shook me awake. We both lay there in silence, listening. The sound of whispering drifted through the open window. Then, a loud bang echoed from the backyard as the wooden door slammed open. Footsteps followed, shuffling around just outside the window. I froze. We hadn't closed the window completely because it was too warm in the room. The footsteps grew closer, and then I heard someone softly shaking the back door, testing it. My heart raced. The curtains were closed so they couldn't see us, but it felt like they were about to come inside. Then the window started to move. I heard it being pushed open even further. Someone muttered something in a language I couldn't understand, and that's when I knew they were trying to break in. My boyfriend and I jumped out of bed, grabbed our phones, and threw on clothes. We ran out of the room without looking back, bolted out of the house, and called the police. My flatmates locked themselves in their rooms while we waited in the street, hoping help would come quickly. To my relief, the police arrived in under 5 minutes. They caught one of the men, but the other one fled. He was found a few streets away, casually smoking. When the police searched their house, they found meth, heroin, and a massive kitchen knife, the same one they'd been carrying when they tried to break in. It was terrifying to think that I had done nothing to provoke them. The idea that they were out there, with no reason other than some twisted motive, trying to get inside, haunted me for months. One of them was sentenced to 2 years in prison for carrying a weapon with the intent to harm, but I never heard anything more from the police. Even now, I struggle to get over it. I still wake up at the slightest noise, and the nightmares haven't stopped. But at least my boyfriend and I are still together, and we talk about it sometimes. That helps, even if the fear still lingers. Last year, after a blissful first year of living alone in a new apartment, a neighbor moved in next door who I will never forget. The layout of the apartments was crucial to this story. My balcony and his were only partially separated by a wall. There was a solid 2-foot gap through which someone could easily walk. Before he moved in, I had a lovely woman living next door. She never crossed the balcony line without an invitation, so I was used to a respectful boundary. The first time I met my new neighbor, he was unloading groceries from a huge truck parked next to mine. As I drove up, he and a woman who I assumed was his girlfriend were busy with boxes. They fell silent as soon as I got out of my car. I nodded to them and went to the elevator. He ran up behind me, dropped his boxes, and asked me to wait. I didn't mind, so I did. In the elevator, I noticed the woman avoided eye contact while he introduced himself and made small talk. In the brief ride up, he asked where I was from, how I liked the place, and where I worked. He seemed overly eager, but I thought it was just new neighbor excitement. For the sake of this story, let's call him Mark. Mark was around 33, 6 feet tall with a slim build, and had his hair cut very short, possibly to hide some thinning. For the first few weeks, we kept running into each other. He was always making small talk and calling me Miss, which I assumed was because he forgot my name. I rarely saw his girlfriend after the first night, but I could hear him talking to someone in his apartment through the thin walls. One night, about 3 months after Mark moved in, my boyfriend was over. We were watching movies around 11:30 p.m. when we heard banging noises from the wall shared with Mark's apartment. My first thought was that he and his girlfriend were having a loud argument. We laughed it off and turned the volume up to drown it out. But soon the banging escalated to screaming, objects being thrown, and glass shattering. The noise was muffled, but it was clear that there was a serious fight going on. My boyfriend went out to the balcony and yelled over, trying to get Mark's attention without crossing the boundary. I could hear the girl on Mark's side eventually open the sliding glass door and apologize for the noise. We decided to ignore it. I was worried but went to bed anyway, which I now regret. I woke up around 3 a.m. to more screaming. My boyfriend was asleep, and I wasn't brave enough to intervene. I considered calling the police, but convinced myself I was just dreaming. I deeply regret not calling them. The next morning, I woke up to terrible news about a friend who had died. I was distracted and didn't think much about the previous night. 2 weeks later, on a warm day, I was outside reading a book in a robe. My chair faced away from Mark's apartment, so I couldn't see his side. Suddenly, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Mark was standing behind me, having crossed onto my side of the balcony. I had to move him to get to my door. Mark told me it was his birthday and asked if I knew where to get weed. Since weed was legal, I suggested checking online for the best dispensaries, but I didn't have any myself. He then mentioned he got very drunk the night before and hit my car. He laughed as he said this, which made my creep senses tingle. He offered to send me his insurance information if I gave him my number. I refused and joked about knocking on his door if the damage was bad. He said he would leave a note with his information on my door and left. I waited an hour before inspecting my car to avoid running into him. I found 2 long scratches on the driver's door. They weren't deep, but still noticeable. I decided to handle it myself and not deal with him. I was unsettled by the encounter. The next Saturday, I was home alone watching a loud action movie with my cat on my lap. Around 11 p.m., I heard banging from the hallway. My cat was spooked, and I noticed the noise getting louder. Then I heard the words no one wants to hear. "Open up, it's the police." My stomach dropped. I had smoked a joint earlier and panicked, worried the police were coming for that. I tried to calm myself before answering the door. I peered through the peephole and saw a cop's face. I opened the door to 6 officers with their guns drawn. I was terrified, thinking I was in trouble for smoking. The lead officer could sense my fear and reassured me I wasn't in trouble. They needed to talk to me about Mark and asked to come in. I let them in, still shaking. They explained that Mark had severely beaten his girlfriend the night before, and she was in the ICU. They also said he had barricaded himself in his apartment and needed to use my balcony to arrest him. They asked me to lock myself in my bedroom and turn off the lights. The next 30 to 45 minutes were excruciating. I had left my cell phone in the kitchen and could only listen to the commotion. There were no gunshots, but a lot of yelling and crashing. Finally, the lead officer returned to tell me that Mark had been arrested and thanked me for letting them use my apartment. They asked a few more questions before leaving. I wish this was where the story ended, but there's more. After Mark's arrest, I worried about him retaliating. I had not said anything incriminating, just mentioned hearing the fight. 5 days later, I saw Mark back at the building as I was coming home. He tried to approach me, but the elevator doors closed before he could reach it. I felt a wave of relief, like narrowly avoiding a car accident. I stayed off my balcony and kept the curtains closed. A few weeks later, Mark stopped me in the parking lot. He wanted to know why I let the cops in and offered me $3,000 to testify on his behalf, claiming I knew how he really treated women. I was speechless and terrified. He wanted me to show up at his hearing, but I managed to escape the conversation. The night before the trial, I came home to find a note taped to my sliding glass door with Mark's phone number and the message, "I am counting on you." I was horrified. I took a photo of the note, grabbed my cat, locked all the doors, and stayed at my mom's house for 5 days. I reported the note to the police, but they didn't follow up. When I returned home with my boyfriend, everything seemed normal. I never saw Mark again. A few weeks later, a woman I didn't recognize was cleaning out his apartment, and new tenants moved in. I tried checking with the police and county jail for information about Mark, but no one could give me any details. I hope he is in jail, as the police suggested. So to Mark, my biggest regret is not calling the police when I felt something was wrong. I hope we never meet again. I was 16 when it all began, back in 2007. My family lived in a small, quiet town that seemed like a postcard from the 1950s. Neat houses, well-manicured lawns, and friendly waves from neighbors. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. One day, a neighbor, a man I'll call Carl, got into a minor dispute with another local. Carl's reaction was to flood their yard, using every hose he could find. Naturally, he was fined for wasting water. My parent worked for the local water district, and Carl decided to drive over and shout at them, claiming that he knew my parent personally. It was a terrible decision. Name-dropping doesn't win you friends, especially when it's used poorly. Carl stormed out of the office, vowing that it was now personal. My family had never interacted with him beyond casual hellos. It didn't matter. Carl began to show up everywhere we went. Whether it was the grocery store, the DMV, or our workplaces, he seemed to pop up with unsettling regularity. It was clear that he had way too much time on his hands. At first, it was just annoying. Carl would call our house, breathing heavily into the phone and then hanging up without saying a word. The calls were creepy, but they didn't feel immediately threatening. That changed when Carl started parking across from our house. From early evening until the early hours of the morning, he sat in his car blasting terrible music and staring at our home. His presence became a constant source of anxiety. It was as if we were living in a horror movie, where the villain's face is always just out of sight. The situation escalated. Carl's behavior grew bolder. One evening, he drove his car up onto the sidewalk, narrowly missing my sibling and their partner as they walked home. It was an act of aggression that left them shaken. Another time, while I was walking my dog, Carl made inappropriate gestures toward me. I was so distraught that I went inside and cried. The police didn't seem to be much help. They told us they couldn't do anything unless Carl made a direct threat or someone was harmed. It felt like the system was waiting for something terrible to happen before taking action. My parent eventually confronted Carl, but this only led to Carl calling the police and accusing us of harassment. It was infuriating to see the system fail us so completely. 2 years in, and things took a horrifying turn. My parents suffered a brain aneurysm. After a tense hospital stay, my other parent came home to rest. That evening, we got a knock at the door. A man in ragged clothes handed over a Christmas present, claiming it was from an anonymous sender. We were uneasy but decided to open it. Inside was a long document, a fake lawsuit Carl had written up, claiming that my parent had wronged him. The document was filled with errors, and it was clear Carl had spent hours crafting this nonsense. It was unsettling to think that someone could be so obsessed and fixated. Carl's harassment continued. He would pace outside his car, making threats during fake phone calls about harming my parent or finding us at our schools and jobs. When I worked late shifts, he'd follow me home, staying right behind me no matter what route I took. I'd have to run to the house, terrified, as he waited across the street. The stress of the aneurysm and Carl's stalking was overwhelming. A family friend who was a district attorney took on our case pro bono. The court process was grueling. We had to provide statements and testify separately, reliving the trauma while being cross-examined and accused of lying. The evidence was strong enough to put Carl away for a year and a half, along with a felony restraining order. We moved away while he was still in prison. My sister passed away during this time, and Carl attempted to sue her estate, claiming the donations from a GoFundMe for her accident were his due to false testimony against him. His actions were as despicable as ever. There's a lot more to this story, but I'll leave it here. Carl, you turned our lives upside down, and it's clear you've learned nothing from your time in prison. About 2 years ago, when I was 17, I got a message on Facebook from someone named Eric. He looked to be around my age and had some mutual friends, so I wasn't immediately concerned. His message started out friendly enough, asking how I had been since we last saw each other. I didn't recognize him, so I replied cautiously, asking if we knew each other. Eric seemed surprised that I didn't remember him and insisted we had known each other before. I didn't respond further. Then, Eric sent a picture of us together from when we were very young, me as a toddler, and him a few years older. The image was from a time I barely remembered, but it was clear we had been neighbors. He explained that he had lived next door to me when we were kids and had recently moved away. I tried to piece together the memory and recalled that we had spent time together as kids, playing in the backyard and hanging out with my older brother. Eric was a few years older, but that was about all I remembered. We continued chatting. As the night approached, I mentioned I was going to bed and turned off my computer. I fell asleep, only to wake up the next morning to a flood of messages from Eric. There were dozens of messages, all sent overnight. They were a mix of well wishes and requests for me to get in touch when I woke up. I was both flattered and unsettled. The sheer number of messages was overwhelming. I skimmed through them, feeling uneasy, and decided not to reply. I had notifications for Facebook Messenger turned off, so I didn't see his new messages until later in the day. By then, Eric had sent more messages, asking about my current address and making strange comments about my family. His messages were increasingly intrusive and oddly personal, even though he no longer lived in the same state. Over the week, Eric's messages became more frequent and bizarre. He kept asking about my family, my home, and his old house. He even suggested we meet up despite the distance between us. I ignored his messages, but his persistence was unsettling. Eventually, I told my mother about Eric's messages. Her reaction was immediate and intense. She seemed alarmed and asked why I was bringing him up. I explained that Eric was trying to reconnect and was sending a lot of messages, but I hadn't responded. My mother then shared a troubling story from my early childhood. She explained that Eric's family had frequently babysat me when I was very young. One day, after a visit to their house, she discovered that Eric had acted inappropriately. Instead of just playing with me, he had done something disturbing that I didn't fully understand at the time. My older brother, who had been in another room, hadn't seen anything. My mother confronted Eric's family, leading to a heated argument. She found out that Eric had behaved similarly towards his younger sister, and the situation had become more serious. My mother threatened to involve the authorities, but before anything could be done, Eric's family moved away. After hearing this, I immediately blocked Eric on Facebook. Despite my efforts, he managed to reach out to my friends, changed his relationship status to "in a relationship with me," and found me on Instagram and Snapchat. He left unwanted comments and sent inappropriate messages. I quickly blocked him on those platforms as well, relieved that he never obtained my phone number. Since then, I haven't heard from Eric or about him again. I hope it stays that way.